June 21, 1941. The largest invasion force in human history is coiled on the Soviet border. 3 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, poised for a lightning strike. But their supreme commander is not planning a war of conquest. He's planning a war of extermination. This wasn't about seizing territory. It was about erasing a people and an idea from existence. How did the hatred burning in one man's mind become the official battle plan for an entire nation? The air in the wolf's lair was always damp and stale. It was a place of concrete and paranoia buried deep in the forests of East Prussia. Here, maps of the world were redrawn, and the fates of millions were decided in rooms thick with cigar smoke and absolute certainty. On this day, Adolf Hitler gathered his most senior generals. These were men of the old Prussian school, who saw war as a grim science of logistics, encirclement, and strategy. They were professionals, the architects of the stunning victory over France just a year earlier. They expected to discuss timetables, supply lines, and pincer movements. They were wrong. Hitler did not begin with military objectives. He began with a sermon on ideology. He looked at the decorated commanders before him, men like Halder, Brauchitsch, and von Rundstedt, and told them that the coming war in the East would be unlike any they had ever fought. It would not be a chivalrous contest between soldiers. The Geneva Conventions would not apply. This was to be a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. Imagine the silence in that bunker. These generals understood violence. They had built their careers on it. But this was something different. This was state-sanctioned savagery, presented as strategic necessity. Hitler explained his vision with chilling clarity. The Soviet Union was not just a political enemy. It was a biological and ideological threat to the German race. It was, in his words, a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy headquartered in the Kremlin. Its brain had to be excised. Its body had to be dismembered. This meant the rules were suspended. Political commissars, the ideological officers of the Red Army, were not to be treated as prisoners of war. They were to be executed on the spot. Jewish people, intellectuals, partisans, and anyone deemed hostile were to be systematically eliminated. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a direct order, a foundational principle of the entire campaign, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. The generals listened. We know from their diaries and post-war testimonies that many were privately appalled. This wasn't war as they knew it. This was mass murder as a tool of policy. It offended their sense of military honor, their traditional code of conduct. General Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, would later write that these orders were repugnant. But in that room, faced with the unshakable will of the Führer, what did they do? Did they object? Did they argue for the laws of war? No, they did not. Here lies the crucial turning point before a single shot had been fired. The German High Command, the professional elite of the Wehrmacht, made a fatal calculation. They saw Hitler's fanaticism not as a moral catastrophe, but as a political problem to be managed. They believed in a quick, decisive victory. They were convinced the Soviet state was a house of cards, rotten from within, ready to collapse at the first hard push. The campaign, they told themselves, would be over in 8 to 10 weeks. By autumn, they would be parading through a conquered Moscow. In the context of a short, victorious war, these brutal orders seemed like a temporary unpleasantry, a harsh but necessary measure to break the enemy's will and secure the rear areas quickly. They rationalized the unthinkable. They convinced themselves that they could fight a clean war at the front, while the dirtier work was handled by others, the SS Einsatzgruppen, who would follow behind the army. They compartmentalized their conscience. This was Hitler's dark genius. He understood his audience. He knew his generals craved victory above all else. He offered them the greatest military prize in history, the conquest of the vast Soviet Empire. And the price of admission was their moral complicity. They paid it willingly. They translated his ideological hatred into operational orders. They instructed their troops that this war demanded merciless and energetic action against Bolshevik agitators, partisans, saboteurs, and Jews. The message filtered down the chain of command, amplified by years of relentless propaganda. The average German soldier crossing the border on June 22nd was not just an invader. He had been taught that he was a crusader. He was told the people he was about to encounter were not fully human. They were Slavic Untermenschen, subhumans, a primitive race fit only for servitude or elimination. Newsreels and posters had dehumanized the enemy for years, paving the way for acts that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. The army was primed for brutality. This raises a deeply uncomfortable question. Was the German army a professional force, a shield for the nation, simply corrupted by Hitler and his Nazi regime? Or was it already a willing sword, an institution that shared enough of his worldview to become the instrument of his genocidal plans? The generals left the wolf's lair with their orders. They returned to their maps and their timetables, pushing aside their misgivings. The immense military machine was ready. The logistics were in place. The soldiers were massed at the border, their tank engines waiting for the signal to roar to life. The ideological foundation for the most brutal war in history had been laid and accepted. The leadership of the army was now partners in a crime they couldn't yet comprehend. With the army's leadership now complicit, the stage was set for a war of annihilation. But what happens when such a plan, a blueprint for pure destruction, collides with the chaotic, unpredictable, and infinitely human reality of the battlefield? The invasion began with an order. Before the first tank crossed the border, before the first artillery shell screamed through the dawn sky, German soldiers were given a directive that would define the war to come. It was simple, direct, and utterly chilling. Any captured Soviet political officer, a man they called a commissar, was to be executed on the spot. This wasn't a suggestion or a battlefield guideline to be interpreted. It was official policy, printed on paper and distributed down the chain of command. For Adolf Hitler, this was never just a war for territory. It was a war to exterminate an idea, and the commissars were its high priests. June 22nd, 1941, 3 a.m. Along a front stretching for nearly 3,000 kilometers, the world held its breath. Then it exploded. 3 million men, thousands of panzers, and waves of Stuka dive bombers surged eastward. Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. In the opening hours, it was a terrifying success. German engineering and tactics, honed to a razor's edge in Poland and France, seemed invincible. We can follow the dust trail of a panzer division in Army Group Center. For its soldiers, the world became a blur of motion, engine roar, and victory. Soviet border defenses, caught completely by surprise, simply evaporated. Communication lines were cut before anyone could report the attack. Entire airfields were destroyed on the ground, planes turned into twisted burning metal before they could take off. The German advance was not a battle. It was a flood. They didn't conquer territory, they consumed it. Miles turned into dozens of miles, then hundreds. The Red Army, vast but poorly led and positioned, appeared to be collapsing. But amidst this whirlwind of military triumph, a darker process was at work. A German infantry unit secures a small village. Dozens of Soviet soldiers surrender, hands in the air, exhausted and defeated. The screening process begins. A non-commissioned officer walks down the line of prisoners. He's not looking for weapons. He's looking for a small red star on their sleeves. He finds one. A man is pulled from the line. He is a political commissar. His job was to ensure the ideological purity and morale of his unit. In the eyes of the Third Reich, this made him not a soldier, but a carrier of the Judeo-Bolshevik plague. The order was clear. There was no interrogation, no transfer to a prisoner of war camp. The commissar was taken behind a ruined building. The other prisoners heard a single pistol shot. This scene repeated itself thousands of times in the summer of 1941. It was the immediate, brutal translation of Hitler's ideology from a Berlin conference room to the muddy fields of Belarus. This policy wasn't universally accepted. Records from the German High Command show a flicker of resistance. A few generals argued against the order. Their objections were practical, not moral. They argued it would violate international law. They warned it would encourage fanatical resistance and tarnish the honor of the German army. Hitler's response was swift and dismissive. He told them this was his war, a new kind of war, and their old-fashioned codes of conduct did not apply. Any officer who refused to carry out the order would be dealt with severely. The dissent was silenced. The machine of annihilation rolled on. Imagine you are a young German lieutenant. You were raised to believe in duty, honor, and obedience. You are a professional soldier, trained to fight other soldiers. Now, you are handed a piece of paper that commands you to become an executioner, to commit murder. Your career, your freedom, perhaps your life, depends on your obedience. What do? The historical record shows what most did. They obeyed. Some with zeal, fully subscribing to the Nazi worldview, others with grim reluctance, convincing themselves it was a necessary evil, and many simply compartmentalized, treating it as just another unpleasant duty in a brutal war. But the generals who had voiced their concerns were proven right, far faster than they could have imagined. The Commissar order was meant to shatter the Red Army's spine, to decapitate its political leadership and cause a total moral collapse. It did the exact opposite. News of the policy spread through the Soviet ranks like wildfire. Soviet propaganda seized upon it, broadcasting the truth to every soldier. Surrender is not an option. Capture means death for your comrades, and likely a far worse fate for you. Suddenly, the nature of the fighting began to change. German units expecting to roll over encircled Soviet forces found themselves locked in desperate, bloody struggles. Red Army soldiers, knowing that surrendering meant the murder of their officers and an uncertain fate for themselves, fought with the fury of men with nothing to lose. Pockets of resistance that should have collapsed in hours held out for days. The easy war Hitler had promised, the one supposed to be over in a few months, was already becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a struggle for survival. From his remote headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler saw only the maps, and the maps looked glorious. His armies were advancing everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners were being taken. The great cities of Minsk and Smolensk had fallen. Kiev was surrounded. To him, this was undeniable proof of his genius. His intuition had triumphed over the cautious pessimism of his generals. The initial victories were staggering, a testament to the power of the Wehrmacht, but they masked a dangerous truth. His very first major ideological order, the cornerstone of his war of annihilation, was already backfiring. It was forging the very enemy he sought to destroy into a harder, more resilient foe. If his first ideological command was already creating such dangerous, unintended consequences, what would happen when he made his first major strategic blunder? In September 1941, the German army achieved the largest encirclement in military history. At Kiev, they captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. It was a stunning textbook victory. So why was it the single biggest mistake of the entire war? The summer was ending. For the men of Army Group Center, the momentum felt unstoppable. They were a sharpened steel spearhead, having torn through hundreds of miles of Soviet territory. Before them lay the ultimate prize, Moscow. The capital was more than just a city. It was the nerve center of the entire Soviet state, the hub for every major railway line, the seat of Stalin's government, the symbolic heart of the Bolshevik regime. The generals on the ground saw the path clearly. Fedor von Bock, the commander of Army Group Center, urged an immediate final push. His most brilliant subordinate, Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Panzer Blitzkrieg, agreed. His tanks were battered and his men were tired, but Moscow was within their grasp. A decisive blow now, they argued, could shatter the Soviet will to fight before winter came. They believed the war could be over in weeks. But in the damp, isolated concrete bunkers of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler was looking at a different map. He wasn't seeing railway junctions or strategic objectives. He was seeing his grand ideological vision. To the south lay Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, rich with grain, coal, and industry. For Hitler, this was the entire point of the war. This was the Lebensraum, the living space he had promised the German people. He saw the capture of economic resources as more important than capturing a symbol. The order came down from his headquarters. It was a shock to the entire High Command. Directive 34 ordered Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group to halt its advance on Moscow. They were to turn 90 degrees south, their new mission, to drive deep behind the Soviet armies defending Kiev and slam the door shut, helping Army Group South complete a massive encirclement. The generals were aghast. This was a violation of every principle of war. They were giving up the main objective to pursue a secondary one. They were splitting their forces, creating a logistical nightmare. Most critically, they were giving up time, precious, irreplaceable time. The Russian autumn, the Rasputitsa, with its deep, immobilizing mud was just around the corner. After that came the winter. Heinz Guderian decided to do the unthinkable. He would confront the Führer directly. He flew from the front lines to the wolf's lair, a man of action entering a sealed tomb of theory and delusion. He was met not with maps and tactical discussion, but with a monologue. Guderian laid out the case with cold military logic. Moscow is the brain. Cut off the brain, and the body will die. The Soviet system is centralized to an extreme degree. Its collapse is inevitable if the capital falls. Hitler did not debate. He lectured. He spoke of the vast wheat fields of Ukraine that would feed the Reich for 1,000 years. He spoke of the industry in the Donbass region that would fuel his war machine. He dismissed the importance of Moscow, calling it a mere geographical expression. His generals, he ranted, were obsessed with outdated Napoleonic ideas of capturing capitals. He, and he alone, understood the new realities of racial and economic warfare. Guderian's arguments were brushed aside. The decision was final. He was ordered to obey. And so the panzers turned south. It was a masterful operation from a purely tactical perspective. Guderian's tanks raced down the flank, linking up with the forces of Army Group South. The jaws of the trap snapped shut. The Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by Semyon Budyonny, was caught. For weeks, the Germans squeezed the pocket. The fighting was horrific, but the result was never in doubt. When the battle was over, the statistics were staggering. The Germans claimed 665,000 prisoners. They had destroyed or captured nearly 900 tanks and over 3,000 artillery pieces. The entire Soviet front in the south had ceased to exist. German newsreels showed endless columns of broken, starving Red Army soldiers being marched into captivity. It looked like the greatest victory of the war. It felt like the Soviet Union was finished. But this victory came at a steep price. Time, an entire month, 4 weeks of the best campaigning weather of the year, squandered. While the panzers were grinding down the resistance in Ukraine, Stalin was performing a miracle of improvisation. He stripped the Far East of his best Siberian divisions, confident that Japan would not attack. He mobilized hundreds of thousands of civilians to dig anti-tank ditches and fortifications around Moscow. He raised new armies from the depths of the country. Every hour that Guderian's tank spent fighting in the south was an hour the defenders of Moscow used to prepare. Was Hitler's decision a complete blunder? Some historians argue that securing the massive Soviet armies on his southern flank was a necessary precaution before advancing on Moscow. That capturing the economic heart of Ukraine was a defensible strategic goal. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. The resources of Ukraine could not be exploited quickly enough to affect the war in 1941. The threat to the flank could have been contained with infantry, leaving the panzers free for their primary mission. Hitler had won his great prize. He had secured the land he coveted for his empire. But in doing so, he had sacrificed his one best chance to win the war the way his generals had planned it. He had traded a swift, strategic knockout blow for a massive, bloody tactical victory. As the last prisoners of Kiev were marched east into a brutal captivity, a cold wind began to blow from the north. The exhausted German army, Its tanks, worn down from the long detour, finally turned back towards its original goal. But the calendar had turned. The season had changed. It was now October. The first autumn rains were beginning to fall, turning the dusty roads into rivers of mud. The men were facing the gates of Moscow, but they would have to fight two new enemies to get there, two of the most ancient and undefeated commanders in Russian history, General Mudd and his brother, General Winter. German soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Victory was just a few miles away. A final push, and the heart of the Soviet Union would be theirs. Then, the temperature dropped to -40 degrees. The oil in their tank engines turned to tar. The grease on their machine guns froze solid. Their greatest enemy wasn't the Red Army. It was their own leadership and a supply chain crippled by ideology. The month lost at Kiev was more than just 30 days on a calendar. It was the last month of good weather. As September bled into October, the generals of Army Group Center knew they were racing against a clock they couldn't control. Hitler, back in his wolf's lair, was ecstatic after the Kiev encirclement. He saw it as proof of his genius and gave the order for the final assault, Operation Typhoon. Its goal was simple and absolute: take Moscow, destroy the Bolshevik capital before winter set in. On paper, the plan was flawless. Two massive armored pincers would close around the city, trapping the last remnants of the Red Army. The Wehrmacht, despite its losses, was still the most formidable fighting force on the planet. For the first 2 weeks of October, it seemed like nothing could stop them. They shattered the Soviet defense lines, creating two more massive encirclements near Vyazma and Bryansk. Another 600,000 Soviet soldiers were marched into captivity. The road to Moscow was wide open. German officers spoke of booking tables at the city's best hotels for their victory celebrations. They believed they were fighting the last battle of the war. Then the rains came. This wasn't just rain. This was the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, the black soil of Russia, churned by thousands of tanks and trucks, dissolved into an endless, bottomless sea of black ooze. Roads simply disappeared. A single truck could get stuck, and an entire column of vehicles stretching for miles behind it would grind to a halt. Horses, the backbone of the German supply system, drowned in the liquid earth. Men sank to their knees in the clinging, freezing muck. The panzers, the iron fist of the blitzkrieg, became useless. They were steel coffins, immobilized in the mire, their engines straining, their tracks churning uselessly. The German advance, which had once measured its progress in tens of miles per day, now measured it in yards. The vanguard of the army was stranded. They were out of fuel, out of ammunition, and their food rations were dwindling. They were at the very gates of Moscow, but cut off from their own army by a continent of mud. Then, in early November, the temperature plunged. The mud froze overnight into iron-hard ruts, a landscape of jagged frozen waves that shattered truck axles and crippled suspensions. The brief relief of solid ground was replaced by a new, far more terrifying enemy. General Winter had arrived. The cold was unlike anything the German soldiers had ever experienced. It was a physical presence, an enemy that seeped through their summer-issue greatcoats and into their very bones. At -20 degrees, starting a tank engine took hours. At -30, Machine guns would fire once and then jam solid. At -40, exposed flesh would freeze in under a minute. Soldiers stood guard duty and were found hours later, frozen solid at their posts, still clutching their rifles. The wounded left on the battlefield didn't die from their injuries. They froze to death. Frostbite became rampant. Men watched in horror as their fingers and toes turned black and numb, the first stage of an agony that often ended in amputation without anesthetic. Why was the most powerful army in the world freezing to death? The official narrative was simple hubris. The High Command had planned for a short war, a victory before autumn. They simply didn't think winter clothing would be necessary, but that is only half the story. The truth is far more sinister, and it lies in the very ideology that started the war. The supply lines were stretched. The partisans were attacking the railways, but trains were still running. The logistical network of the Reich, a marvel of brutal efficiency, was still functioning. So what were these trains carrying, if not winter coats, antifreeze, and rations for the men at the front? Archival records from the Reichsbahn, the German state railway, tell the story. During the critical months of October and November 1941, while Army Group Center was freezing outside Moscow, vast amounts of rolling stock were being diverted for other tasks. These trains were being sent into occupied Poland and Ukraine, not to supply the front, but to empty the ghettos. They were packed with hundreds of thousands of captured Jews, transported to concentration camps. The ideological war, the war of annihilation, took precedence over the military one. A German soldier froze to death outside Moscow because the train that could have brought him a winter coat was instead being used to transport a family to a death camp. The choice had been made. The German soldiers didn't know this. All they knew was the cold and the gnawing hunger. They were exhausted, demoralized, and at the absolute limit of human endurance. Huddled in shallow trenches, burning whatever they could find to stay alive, they believed the Red Army was in an even worse state. They believed one more push was all it would take. They were wrong. Just as the German advance had completely stalled, the Soviets unleashed their secret weapon. For months, Joseph Stalin had been receiving intelligence from his master spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, confirming that Imperial Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. This allowed Stalin to do the unthinkable. He stripped his Siberian border of its best divisions and secretly transported them thousands of miles west to the defense of Moscow. Suddenly, out of the swirling snows, a new kind of enemy appeared. These were not the broken, demoralized troops the Germans had faced for months. These were the Siberians. They wore white camouflage overalls, thick fur hats, and warm felt-lined boots. They were fresh, fully supplied, and trained to fight and win in these exact conditions. Their T-34 tanks, with their wider tracks and diesel engines, worked perfectly in the extreme cold. Their skis allowed them to glide silently over the snow, appearing behind German lines as if from nowhere. On the 5th of December, they attacked. For the freezing, starving German soldiers, it was a vision from hell. A silent white wave of ghosts swept over them. The German lines didn't bend. They shattered. Panic, a word unknown to the Wehrmacht in this war, spread like a virus. Units disintegrated. Men abandoned their frozen tanks, their artillery, their machine guns, and simply ran. They ran west, away from the terrifying specter of the Siberian counterattack. The invincible Wehrmacht was now in a full, panicked retreat from Moscow. For the first time, the blitzkrieg was rolling backwards. Miles of abandoned German equipment littered the frozen roads, a monument to a catastrophic failure. Back in the Wolf's Lair, the reports flooding in painted a picture of utter disaster. His generals pleaded for permission to conduct a strategic withdrawal, to pull back to a defensible line. With his entire strategy collapsing, his ideology proven fatal on the battlefield, how would Hitler, the man who never retreats, react to the first catastrophic failure of his military career? The German line before Moscow was collapsing. Generals were ordering retreats to save their men. Then came a message from Hitler. No retreat. Stand and die where you are. It was military suicide, and it worked. December 1941. Outside Moscow, the world had frozen solid. The temperature plummeted to -30, then -40 degrees Celsius. For the soldiers of Army Group Center, this was a cold beyond comprehension. It was an active, malevolent enemy. Steel rifle bolts snapped. Lubricants in machine guns turned to useless sludge. Engines refused to start. More German soldiers were falling to frostbite than to Soviet bullets. They had no winter uniforms, no proper boots, no antifreeze. They had only the Führer's promise of a swift victory, a promise that now seemed like a grotesque joke. And then the Soviets attacked. On December 5th, General Georgy Zhukov unleashed over 100 fresh divisions. These were not the broken, retreating soldiers the Germans had faced all summer. These were Siberian troops equipped for this world of ice. They wore white camouflage, padded winter coats, and felt boots. They advanced on skis, their T-34 tanks churning through the snow that trapped the German panzers. The German front did not bend. It shattered. Entire divisions began to disintegrate. Communications failed. Units were cut off, surrounded. Panic began to set in. For the professional German commanders on the ground, the situation was terrifyingly clear. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, saw only one option: a strategic withdrawal. Pull back, form a shorter, more defensible line, and save the army from annihilation to fight again in the spring. This was textbook military doctrine, the only sane choice. His brilliant panzer commander Heinz Guderian agreed. He ordered his own units to begin a limited pullback, a fighting retreat to save what could be saved. It was an act of military necessity, but also an act of defiance. Back in the Wolf's Lair, hundreds of miles from the frozen battlefield, Adolf Hitler saw the maps. He saw the red arrows of the Soviet counteroffensive slicing through his lines. But he did not see a military crisis. He saw a spiritual one. He was haunted by a ghost from history, Napoleon's disastrous retreat from Moscow in 1812. He saw the Grande Armée destroyed not by battle, but by a collapse of will, by the long, agonizing retreat through the very same snows. To Hitler, retreat was not a strategy. It was a disease of the soul. It was the same weakness he believed had caused Germany's defeat in 1918. A failure of nerve, a stab in the back. Guderian, horrified, flew from the front to meet Hitler in person. He stood before the Führer, still wearing his thick winter greatcoat, the chill of the front line clinging to him. He laid out the facts, the frozen equipment, the catastrophic losses to the cold, the strength of the Soviet attack. He begged for permission to conduct an orderly withdrawal. Hitler listened, his eyes cold. He was not interested in facts about tank engines or frostbite casualties. He was interested in one thing: will. He asked Guderian about the morale of the troops, then dismissed the general's arguments. The army would not retreat a single step. The confrontation was absolute, the pragmatism of the professional soldier against the ideological fanaticism of the Führer. Hitler's response was swift and brutal. He fired his commander-in-chief, Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. He fired Fedor von Bock. He fired Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg. In a move that stunned the German High Command, Hitler announced that he, personally, was taking direct command of the army. From that moment on, every major decision on the Eastern Front would be his alone. His first order was the infamous Haltebefehl, the stand-fast order. Transmitted to every unit on the front, its language was unequivocal. There would be no withdrawals. Every man will hold his position to the last. Every village, every trench, every frozen ditch was to be defended until death. Commanders who ordered retreats would be court-martialed. It was an order that defied all military logic. You cannot command a blizzard to stop. You cannot command a tank to start at -40 degrees. You are ordering men to become statues of ice, to be overrun and annihilated. To the generals, this was not a strategy. It was a death sentence for Army Group Center. Imagine you are a German soldier in a shallow snow pit outside Moscow. You haven't been warm in weeks. Your fingers are black with frostbite. Your rifle is a useless club of frozen metal. You see waves of Siberian soldiers advancing through the swirling snow, and you hear the order over the radio. You are forbidden to retreat. You must stand here and die. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of men. They dug in. They used frozen corpses as sandbags. They fought with bayonets and grenades when their guns failed. The line held. It was a miracle of brutality. The German soldiers' discipline was so ingrained, their fear of their own high command so potent, that they obeyed. They died in staggering numbers, but they did not run. Against all expectations, the Soviet offensive began to falter. Zhukov's forces were also reaching the limits of their supply lines. They had pushed the Germans back, but they lacked the logistical power to land a final decisive knockout blow. The German line, anchored by a sheer stubborn refusal to move, became a breakwater against which the Soviet tide crashed and receded. The front stabilized. The winter crisis was over. Army Group Center had not been destroyed. In the wolf's lair, Hitler saw this as the ultimate vindication. He had been right. The generals, with all their experience and their textbooks, had been wrong. They had panicked. They had shown weakness. He, through his superior will, his unshakable nerve, had saved the army. He had stared into the abyss and forced it to blink. It was a moment of profound and poisonous revelation. He learned a terrible lesson on the frozen plains of Moscow, that logistics, supplies, weather, and enemy strength were all secondary. They could all be overcome by sheer fanatical willpower. any crisis could be solved by simply refusing to yield. Was it a moment of military genius? Or was it a desperate, insane gamble that paid off through his soldiers' discipline and his enemies' exhaustion? The outcome doesn't change the truth. Hitler now believed his own will was a literal weapon of war, more powerful than any panzer division. What would happen when he tried to apply this lesson to a new offensive aimed at a city that bears his enemy's name? In the summer of 1942, Hitler had a choice. He could use his battered army to finish off the Soviets, or he could seize the vast oil fields of the Caucasus. He chose oil. But his seemingly logical plan had a fatal ideological flaw, one that would lead his most powerful army into the most infamous battle in human history. The winter of 1941 had nearly destroyed the German army. The stand fast order saved the front from total collapse, but the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men were dead, wounded, or crippled by frostbite. Tanks and trucks were frozen wrecks. The Wehrmacht was alive, but barely. It could no longer attack along the entire 1,000-mile front. The blitzkrieg of the previous summer was a distant memory. Germany had to focus its remaining strength on a single, decisive objective. And that objective was oil. Every tank, plane, and truck in the German war machine ran on fuel, and Germany's reserves were dangerously low. The entire war effort could grind to a halt within a year. The Soviet Union, however, had an ocean of it. The fields of Maikop, Grozny, and the ultimate prize, Baku on the Caspian Sea, produced nearly 90% of all Soviet oil. Seize them, and Germany could fight forever. Seize them, and the Red Army would be paralyzed. The plan had a name, Case Blue. On paper, it was brutally logical. Army Group South, the strongest German formation on the front, would punch a hole in the Soviet lines and sweep southeast across the open steppe, a vast sea of grass perfect for panzer warfare. It was a massive, concentrated, armored fist aimed directly at the heart of the Soviet economy. A war to be won not by ideology, but by economics. In the damp concrete bunker of the Wolf's Lair, the chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, spread his maps. He was a professional soldier, a man who thought in terms of logistics and calculations. He saw the logic of Case Blue, but he also saw the immense danger. He argued for a single overwhelming thrust. Keep the army group together, protect its flanks as it drove deeper into enemy territory. It was sound military doctrine. It was common sense. But Hitler was not a man of common sense. He was a man of will and intuition. He looked at the same map as Halder, but saw something different. As the army group moved southeast, it would pass a city on the Volga River, a major industrial center, a key transport hub. For Hitler, though, its real importance was its name, Stalingrad, the city of Stalin. The symbolic value was irresistible. Capturing the city that bore the name of his arch-nemesis would be a propaganda victory beyond measure, a way to humiliate the Soviet regime on a global stage. The pragmatism of the oil strategy began to warp, twisted by the gravity of this one ideological prize. And so, Hitler made his decision, one that made the professional soldiers in the room hold their breath. He would split Army Group South. He would tear his powerful armored fist in two. One part, Army Group A would continue the drive south towards the oil fields. The other, Army Group B, anchored by the formidable Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, would turn east. It would march hundreds of miles to the Volga and seize Stalingrad. They would pursue both objectives at the same time. Halder was aghast. He protested, pointing to the lines on the map, the numbers, the cold, hard facts of logistics. Splitting the force would weaken both drives. Worse, it would create an impossibly long, exposed flank. 1,000-kilometer northern flank for the forces driving south. 1,000-kilometer southern flank for the forces driving east. An open wound stretching across the empty steppe. Hitler didn't listen. He didn't debate. He proclaimed. He saw Halder's caution not as professional prudence, but as weakness, cowardice. He dismissed the concerns out of hand. His will would be enough. The subhuman Slavs would collapse just as they had the year before. The flank could be held by Germany's allies, the Romanians, the Italians, the Hungarians. Splitting one's forces is a fundamental military error, one of the first things a soldier learns not to do. But Hitler ignored this basic rule. For him, this was never just a military campaign. The symbolic capture of Stalin's city was just as important, if not more so, than the fuel needed to run his tanks. The war was an extension of his own ego, and his ego demanded Stalingrad. Halder continued to object. A few months later, Hitler dismissed him, screaming that his own offensive spirit was being broken by the textbook wisdom of his generals. On June 28, 1942, Case Blue began. At first, it was a stunning success. Panzers rolled across the sun-baked landscape. Soviet defenses, still recovering from the previous year, crumbled. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. The Sixth Army advanced with breathtaking speed, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. It seemed Hitler's intuition had been right all along. His genius was, once again, confirmed. But as the two army groups diverged, the gap between them grew wider. Army Group A pushed deep into the Caucasus Mountains, its spearheads getting tantalizingly close to the oil fields. But its northern flank was now completely exposed. And the Sixth Army. While the Sixth Army fought in the ruins of Stalingrad, a second secret war was raging behind them. It wasn't a war fought by soldiers in uniform, but by farmers, women, and children. This is the story of how Nazi brutality created its own worst enemy, the story of the partisan. When German tanks first rolled into Ukraine and Belarus in the summer of 1941, they weren't always met with gunfire. In many villages, they were greeted as liberators. People who had suffered under Stalin's brutal collectivization offered the German soldiers bread and salt, the traditional Slavic welcome. They believed this was the end of one nightmare. They had no idea a far worse one was about to begin. For Adolf Hitler, this was not a war of liberation. It was a war of colonization. The vast, fertile lands of the East were Germany's promised Lebensraum, living space. And the people who lived there? In the cold calculus of Nazi ideology, they were Untermenschen, subhumans, obstacles to be removed. The orders from Hitler's headquarters were clear and absolute. This land was to be exploited, its resources stripped bare to feed the German Reich and fuel its war machine. Every sack of grain, every cow, every chicken was now the property of the conquerors. Those who resisted would be made an example of. And so the terror began. This wasn't random violence. It was organized policy. Public hangings became a common sight in town squares, a simple wooden gallows serving as a constant reminder of the new order. Signs were often hung from the necks of the victims, listing their supposed crimes, hoarding food, helping a Soviet soldier, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Collective punishment was ruthlessly applied. If a partisan cut a telephone line, an entire village might be burned to the ground. If one German soldier was killed on a road, 10 civilians would be shot in retaliation, or 50, or 100. The number was arbitrary, designed only to sow fear. The message was simple. Resistance was futile and would only bring an avalanche of wrath upon everyone. But you cannot starve a people, enslave them, and murder their families and expect them to remain passive. Fear is a powerful weapon, but desperation is stronger. A man who has lost everything has nothing left to lose. The policy of terror was meant to break the spirit of the population. Instead, it forged them into an army. It started small. A farmer leaving a pitchfork on a road at night to puncture a German truck's tire. A railway worker subtly misaligning a switch. A teenager cutting a telegraph wire. These were isolated acts of defiance. But soon they began to connect. Groups of escaped Red Army soldiers, hiding in the vast forests, found common cause with angry villagers. They organized. They armed themselves with captured German rifles, old hunting shotguns, and homemade explosives. The partisan movement was born. They were not an army that would meet you on an open field. They were ghosts. They lived in the dense forests and impassable swamps the German army could not control. They knew the land, every path, every hiding place, and their primary target was the German supply line. Imagine what that means for the war effort. The German army on the Eastern Front was a vast, mechanized beast. But that beast had a very long, very fragile tail. Every tank at the front needed fuel. Every soldier needed ammunition, food, and medicine. All of it had to travel hundreds, even thousands of kilometers from Germany, across a lifeline of a few crucial railway lines and a network of poor-quality roads. This was the lifeline the partisans sought to sever. A single, well-placed explosive charge could derail a train carrying tanks. A nighttime ambush could wipe out a convoy of supply trucks. They burned bridges, attacked depots, and assassinated German officials. They turned the German rear, what was supposed to be a secure zone, into a second front. The German generals on the ground saw the disaster unfolding. Men like Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, understood the strategic reality. You cannot wage a successful campaign when your rear is in flames. They sent frantic reports to Hitler's headquarters, arguing that the brutal occupation policies were a catastrophic failure. They weren't pacifying the population. They were creating an endless supply of new enemies. The generals proposed a different path, a political solution. They suggested treating the populations, especially in places like Ukraine, as allies against Stalin. Give them a degree of autonomy. Allow them to form their own anti-communist militias. Win them over. It was a pragmatic military argument. It was also an argument Adolf Hitler was ideologically incapable of hearing. To Hitler, reports of growing partisan resistance weren't proof of a failed policy. They were proof of the Slavs' inherent treachery. His response was not to change course, but to double down. He didn't want allies, he wanted slaves. He unleashed the SS and special police units under men like Erich von Dembach-Zelewski, with one simple order: crush the partisan movement with unrestrained brutality. This anti-partisan warfare became a euphemism for extermination. Entire regions were declared dead zones. Every man, woman, and child was now considered a potential enemy to be eliminated. The terror escalated to an industrial scale. Germany was now choosing to fight a war against the very people it occupied, creating a sea of hatred behind its own lines. The German soldier was now trapped. Before him stood the Red Army, growing stronger every day. Behind him, the forests were alive with enemies. Every road could hide a mine, every village an ambush. The vast distances that were once a symbol of their stunning advance were now a source of constant dread. They were an army adrift in a hostile ocean. The German army was now fighting a war on two fronts, not against France and Russia, but against the Red Army before them and a sea of partisans behind them. Their vital supply lines were under constant, relentless attack. With that lifeline being choked, artery by artery, how could the Sixth Army possibly survive, cut off in the frozen hell of Stalingrad? November 19th, 1942. On the frozen steppe west of Stalingrad, a coded message reaches the commander of the German Sixth Army. The radio crackles with a terrible clarity. Soviet tanks are pouring through the Romanian lines. He didn't know it yet. His generals didn't know it yet. But the 300,000 men under his command had just been sealed inside a tomb. For months, the battle for Stalingrad had been a meat grinder, a brutal street-by-street fight in a city of rubble. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was fixated on this single point. They had pushed the Soviets to the very edge of the Volga River. Victory seemed imminent. But while the Germans stared forward into the ruins, the Soviets looked wider. They looked at the map. They saw the weakness. The flanks of the Sixth Army weren't held by elite German troops. They were held by their allies, the Third and Fourth Romanian armies and the Eighth Italian Army. These were soldiers who were poorly equipped, poorly supplied, and poorly motivated. Their anti-tank guns were a joke against the Soviet T-34. Their morale was already broken by the coming winter. The German High Command knew this was a risk. They had warned of it, but the warnings were ignored. And now, the storm broke. At dawn on November 19th, the Soviet artillery erupts. Thousands of guns, a wall of fire and steel that shatters the Romanian positions to the northwest. Then come the tanks. Hundreds of them, followed by waves of infantry. They don't slow down. They don't stop. They simply roll over the crumbling defenses. The next day, a second hammer blow falls to the south of Stalingrad. Another massive Soviet force smashes through the other Romanian army. This was Operation Uranus, a classic pincer movement executed on a gigantic scale, two immense steel claws designed to snap shut behind the German Sixth Army. In Berlin, the initial reports are dismissed as Soviet propaganda. At Hitler's headquarters, they are met with disbelief. It couldn't be happening. The Red Army was supposed to be on its last legs. A few desperate localized attacks, perhaps. But not this. Not a coordinated offensive involving over 1 million men. But on the steppe, the reality was undeniable. The pincers were closing fast. Within 4 days they met at the town of Kalach-on-Don. The trap was sprung. The entire German Sixth Army, along with parts of the Fourth Panzer Army, was surrounded. Nearly 300,000 men, 22 divisions, an entire army group, now cut off and isolated in a vast hostile wilderness of snow. General Paulus was a meticulous staff officer, not a gambler. He looked at his maps, his fuel gauges, his ammunition reports. The conclusion was cold, logical, and immediate. They had to break out. Now, while they still had the strength, while the Soviet ring was still thin. He radioed Hitler's headquarters, urgently requesting permission to fight his way west to save his army from annihilation. It was the only sane military option. The message arrives at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's gloomy concrete bunker complex in East Prussia. The atmosphere is thick with tension. The generals present the facts. They point to the maps. They all agree with Paulus. A breakout is essential. But Hitler doesn't see a map of tactical realities. He sees a map of his own will. For him, Stalingrad is no longer just a city. It is a symbol. The city named after his arch-nemesis. He had publicly declared it would be taken. To retreat now would be a humiliation. It would be a spiritual defeat, a crack in the myth of his own infallibility. He listens to their arguments, his face a mask of fury. He sees weakness. He sees the ghost of 1918, the year Germany collapsed from within. He thunders at his generals. There will be no retreat. The Sixth Army will stand fast. They will form a hedgehog defense, an all-round fortress. I will not leave the Volga, he screams. The generals are aghast. This is suicide. How can an army of 300,000 men survive surrounded with winter setting in? They need food. They need ammunition. They need fuel. They need medical supplies. The railway lines are cut. The roads are blocked. There is no way to supply them. It is a death sentence. And then a voice cuts through the despair. It is the voice of Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor. He is a man desperate to regain his lost prestige, to prove his worth to his Führer. He sees his moment. He makes a bold, spectacular, and utterly baseless promise. "My Führer," he boasts, "I will supply the Sixth Army from the air." The generals are stunned into silence. They know the numbers. The Sixth Army required a minimum of 500 tons of supplies every single day just to survive, not to fight, just to survive. The Luftwaffe didn't have enough transport planes. The weather was atrocious. The Soviet Air Force controlled the skies around Stalingrad. Göring's promise was not just optimistic. It was a fantasy, a grotesque lie. Why did he do it? Was it pure arrogance? A sycophantic attempt to tell Hitler exactly what he wanted to hear? Or was he so detached from the reality of his own Air Force that he actually believed it was possible? The question haunts historians to this day, but the motive in the end didn't matter. What mattered was that Hitler seized upon the lie. It was the perfect solution for him. It allowed him to ignore military reality. It gave him the excuse he needed to enforce his ideological command to stand and die. He could now claim a technical solution existed. The army wouldn't have to retreat. because Goering's air bridge would save them. The decision was made. Permission to break out was officially and finally denied. The order goes out to General Paulus. The Sixth Army is to hold its position. It is now designated Fortress Stalingrad. The men in the frozen trenches receive the news. For a moment, there is hope. The Führer has a plan. The Luftwaffe is coming. They watch the skies, waiting for the promised salvation. But the salvation never comes. The few transport planes that make it through the blizzards and the Soviet fighters are a drop in the ocean. Instead of 500 tons a day, they are lucky to get 50. Sometimes none at all. The promised air bridge is a catastrophic failure from its very first day. The Sixth Army is now trapped, starving, and freezing, forbidden to save themselves by the man who sent them there. With the fantasy of an airlift dissolving into the winter sky, is there any hope left for the men in the Stalingrad cauldron? Inside Stalingrad, German soldiers boiled their leather belts for food. On the radio back home, the government told their families the Sixth Army was being heroically supplied. They were a fortress on the Volga, holding back the tide of Bolshevism, but this fortress was a tomb, and the men inside were already ghosts. How long could Hitler keep this fiction alive while 300,000 of his soldiers froze to death for a lie? It was January 1943. For the German Sixth Army trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, hell had finally frozen over. The city was a cauldron, a Kessel, as the Germans called it, and inside, an entire army was being boiled down to nothing. The daily ration was less than 200 grams of bread, mixed with sawdust to add bulk. After the last of 14,000 horses were eaten, the men turned to dogs, then rats. Finally, they turned to their own equipment. To eat a leather belt, you boil it for hours until it becomes a gelatinous, foul-tasting sludge. It offers almost no nutrition, but for a little while it fills the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. Imagine the cold, a cold that seeps into your bones and freezes the will to live. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 Celsius. With no fuel for fires, men huddled together in bombed-out basements, their greatcoats thin and useless. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and noses. Gangrene turned limbs black. In the makeshift hospitals, there were no anesthetics, no bandages, no medicine. The wounded were simply laid in rows to die, their quiet moans a constant soundtrack to the city's destruction. All the while, Soviet artillery never stopped. Soviet snipers picked off anyone who moved. The war had shrunk from a grand campaign to a desperate minute-by-minute struggle for the next breath. Hundreds of miles away, in the damp concrete of the Wolf's Lair, a different reality was being manufactured. Here, Hitler stood over his maps, warmed by stoves and surrounded by the sycophantic nods of his inner circle. On the wall, the Stalingrad pocket was marked in red, a proud symbol of German defiance. Hitler was clinging to a promise. The head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, had personally guaranteed he could supply the Sixth Army by air. An air bridge, he called it. A fleet of transport planes would deliver 500 tons of supplies every single day. It was a bold, confident assertion. It was also a complete fantasy. The Luftwaffe was not equipped for such a task. They lacked the transport planes. The ones they had were obsolete. The weather was atrocious, with blizzards grounding flights for days. And the Soviet Air Force and anti-aircraft guns were waiting. On a good day, the air bridge delivered perhaps 100 tons. Some days, less than 10. Often, the precious crates of supplies fell into Soviet lines. Goering's promise wasn't just broken, it was a cynical fabrication from the start. Yet Hitler clung to it. Any general who presented the true numbers was accused of cowardice and defeatism. In his mind, the will of the Führer was a physical force, more powerful than fuel consumption, cargo capacity, or a Russian winter. Outside the bunker, however, some still dealt in the currency of reality. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, assembled a relief force, Operation Winter Storm. A spearhead of panzer divisions would punch a hole through the Soviet encirclement. They fought through blizzards and desperate Soviet resistance, clawing their way forward, kilometer by bloody kilometer. By late December, they were just 30 miles from the edge of the Stalingrad pocket. The trapped soldiers could see the flares of the relief force in the night sky. For the first time in weeks, hope was a tangible thing. Manstein sent a frantic message to General Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army. "Break out now!" The panzers could hold a corridor open, but they couldn't break through on their own. The Sixth Army had to attack from the inside to meet them. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only move left on the board. Paulus, a man defined by his obedience, did what he always did. He radioed the Wolf's Lair and asked for the Führer's permission. The answer from Hitler was cold and absolute. No, the Sixth Army would hold its positions. The Führer forbids any surrender of ground. The order was a death sentence. Manstein's panzers, out of fuel and taking heavy losses, were forced to retreat. The relief attempt had failed. The flares on the horizon vanished, and with them the last glimmer of hope for the men in the cauldron. After that, the end came swiftly. The Soviets launched their final offensive, Operation Ring, slicing the German pocket in two. Resistance crumbled. Soldiers surrendered in droves, skeletal figures emerging from basements with their hands in the air. In the freezing cellar of a ruined department store, General Paulus and his staff huddled together. Communication with the outside world was almost gone. Then a final, bizarre message crackled through the static from Hitler's headquarters. It was a promotion. Effective immediately, Friedrich Paulus was now a Generalfeldmarschall, a field marshal, the highest rank in the German army. It looked like an honor, a reward for his steadfastness. It was anything but. It was an execution order wrapped in velvet. In the entire history of the German military, no field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear. There would be no capture, no humiliation. Paulus was to take his own life. His suicide would be the final act of propaganda, a heroic sacrifice for the fatherland. But Paulus, the man who had followed every insane order, who had sacrificed his army on the altar of Hitler's ego, finally broke. He looked at the ruin around him, at the faces of his starving staff. He had followed ideology into the abyss, but he would not let it dictate his final moment. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus did the one thing he was forbidden to do. He surrendered. When Hitler heard the news from Stalingrad hit Germany like a physical blow. For weeks, the state-controlled radio had spoken only of heroic resistance, of a fortress on the Volga that would never fall. Then, on February 3rd, 1943, the music stopped. A somber drum roll played for 3 days. The truth, wrapped in the language of martyrdom, was finally announced. The Sixth Army was gone, annihilated. Nearly 250,000 men lost. For the first time, the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered. A quiet fear began to creep into German homes. The war, once a distant spectacle of victory parades, now felt dangerously close. The Nazi regime was on the brink of a crisis of faith. Hitler, secluded in his wolf's lair, fell into a deep, brooding silence. The task of restoring the nation's morale fell to his master propagandist, Dr. Joseph Goebbels. He understood that doubt was a poison. It had to be purged with a radical, overwhelming dose of fanaticism. He planned a spectacle, a piece of political theater so powerful it would not just rally the faithful, but forge a new terrifying national consensus. On February 18th, the Berlin Sportpalast was prepared. This was no ordinary rally. The audience was hand-picked. Decorated soldiers on leave, armaments workers, doctors, artists, and mothers of fighting men. They were the supposed cross-section of the nation. The hall was a cavern of red, black, and white. Swastika banners hung from the ceiling like immense predatory birds. Searchlights cut through the thick cigarette smoke, converging on the podium. The air was heavy with anticipation, a mix of grief and defiance. This was a church for a dark religion, and its congregation was waiting for a sermon. When Goebbels walked to the microphone, he seemed to feed on the energy in the room. He was small, but his presence was electric. He didn't begin with reassurances. He began with the stark truth. He spoke of the grave, serious situation. He acknowledged the storm from the steppe that threatened to break over them. He painted a picture of an apocalyptic threat, Judeo-Bolshevism, a demonic force that would enslave German women and murder their children. He was not offering comfort. He was stoking fear into white-hot rage. Then he began his catechism. 10 questions for the German people. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, then rising to a fanatical shriek. The English maintain that the German people have lost faith in the Führer, he yelled. The crowd's response was a unified, guttural cry of defiance. No, no, no! He let the sound wash over him. Are you and the German people willing to work, he continued, if the Führer orders 10, 12, and if necessary, 14 hours a day, and to give everything for victory? A thunderous yes shook the rafters. He built the pressure, question by question, whipping the audience into a frenzy. He asked if they wanted a war more total, more radical than anything they could even imagine. Each yes was louder, more fervent than the last. Finally, the climax. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, his eyes scanning the thousands of enraptured faces. Ich frag euch, he screamed, his voice cracking with manufactured passion. I ask you, do you want total war? The response was not just a cheer. It was a physical force, a wave of sound, a primal roar from thousands of voices screaming as one. Men and women, their faces contorted with emotion, leapt to their feet. Arms shot out in the Nazi salute. It was a mass hysteria, carefully orchestrated and terrifying to behold. For 2 hours, Goebbels had stripped away their individuality and merged them into a single fanatical entity. They were no longer just citizens. They were soldiers in a fight to the death. The broadcast of this speech, piped into every home, was a declaration. The gloves were off. Germany was now a nation whose sole purpose was to wage war. But summer 1943, at a place called Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history is about to begin. Germany had a secret weapon, a new generation of armored beasts, the Panther and Tiger tanks. They were designed to be unstoppable, but Adolf Hitler's obsession with his new toys would turn his greatest offensive into his final, crushing defeat. After the catastrophe of Stalingrad, the German war machine was wounded, but not broken. The Führer needed a victory, a decisive, spectacular victory, to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. His generals, led by the brilliant Erich von Manstein, saw an opportunity. A huge bulge or salient had formed in the Soviet lines around the city of Kursk. It was a perfect target. The German plan was codenamed Operation Citadel. The concept was a classic pincer movement, a strategy as old as war itself. Two massive armored groups, one from the north and one from the south, would drive into the salient. They would meet in the middle, trapping and destroying nearly a fifth of the entire Red Army. It would be a blow from which the Soviets might never recover. Manstein and his fellow commanders urged speed. They wanted to attack in May, before the Soviets could recover from the winter's fighting, before they could dig in. The Wehrmacht was at its peak strength for the year. The ground was dry. The time was now. But Hitler hesitated. He was mesmerized by the promise of new technology. German factories were churning out the new Panzer V, the Panther. It had sloped armor inspired by the Soviet T-34 and a long, high-velocity 75mm gun that could kill enemy tanks from a great distance. And then there was the Tiger, the Panzer VI, a 54-ton monster. Its armor was so thick that most Soviet guns couldn't scratch its paint. Its 88mm cannon was the most feared anti-tank weapon in the world. To Hitler, these were not just machines. They were proof of German superiority, silver bullets that could solve his problems. He didn't just want to win at Kursk. He wanted to annihilate the enemy with his new weapons, and he didn't have enough of them yet. So against the frantic advice of his commanders, he made a fateful decision. He would wait. He postponed Citadel. Just for a few weeks, he promised. He needed more Tigers. He needed more Panthers. Every day of delay, he believed, made his army stronger. He was catastrophically wrong. Every single day of delay made the Soviet trap deadlier. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. Their intelligence networks, from partisans behind German lines to the legendary Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, fed them a constant stream of information. They knew where the Germans would strike. They knew which units were massing. They even knew about the new tanks. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who had saved Moscow, devised a brilliant and counterintuitive plan. He advised Stalin not to launch a preemptive strike. Do not attack the Germans while they gather. Instead, let them come. Let them break themselves against a defense so deep, so dense, so lethal. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. So, as the German panzers waited for Hitler's green light, the Red Army dug and dug and dug. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians worked day and night, turning the Kursk salient into a fortress. They packed the earth with over 400,000 mines, sometimes 5,000, to a single mile of front. They dug 5,000 miles of trenches, enough to stretch from Moscow to New York. They built layer after layer of defense, 8 distinct defensive belts in some areas, stretching back over 100 miles. Within these belts, they hid their guns. Entire anti-tank regiments were buried, their cannons pointing across pre-sighted fields of fire. They created killing grounds designed to funnel the German panzers into a storm of steel. The Soviets were not just preparing to stop an attack. They were preparing a graveyard for Germany's armored might. Finally, in early July, Hitler was satisfied. The panzer divisions were reinforced. Nearly 200 Tigers and over 600 Panthers were ready for their combat debut. On the 5th of July, 1943, Operation Citadel began. The earth trembled as thousands of German guns opened fire. The greatest tank offensive ever conceived lurched forward. In the south, Manstein's forces, with the elite SS Panzer Corps in the lead, made some progress. The Tigers were terrifyingly effective, knocking out T-34s from ranges the Soviets thought were safe. But the cost was staggering. The advance was not a blitzkrieg. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through a landscape of death. For the German tank crews, it was a nightmare. They would push through one line of trenches only to find another just beyond it. They would navigate a minefield only to run straight into a wall of anti-tank fire from perfectly camouflaged guns. The new Panthers rushed into production, suffered from crippling mechanical failures. Their engines caught fire, their transmissions broke. Many were lost without ever seeing the enemy. The Tigers, while powerful, were slow and became easy targets for Soviet ground attack aircraft. The Red Army soldiers fought with ferocious bravery, sometimes strapping grenades to their bodies and rolling under the German behemoths. They had been told to hold at all costs, and they did. After a week of brutal, relentless fighting, the German offensive had bogged down completely. They had inflicted enormous losses on the Soviets, but their own losses were unsustainable. The SS Panzer divisions were shattered. The promise of the wonder weapons had dissolved into the mud and blood of the Russian steppe. The grand pincer movement had failed. And then, in the Wolf's Lair, hundreds of miles from the front, the final blow fell. It did not come from the Red Army, it came from the Mediterranean. On the 10th of July, the Allies landed in Sicily. Suddenly, Hitler had a two-front war he could no longer ignore. His attention, his obsession, snapped away from Kursk. He summoned Manstein and the other commanders to his headquarters. They pleaded with him, arguing that the battle was not yet lost, that they could still grind down the Soviet reserves. Hitler didn't listen. His focus was already elsewhere. He was worried about Italy. He needed his elite SS divisions to counter the Allied invasion. On the 13th of July, just 8 days after it began, he officially canceled Operation Citadel. The greatest tank offensive in history was over. Not with a bang, but with a Führer's whim. Think about that for a moment. If Hitler had listened to Manstein, if he had launched the attack in May, could he have won? Could a swift strike against an unprepared enemy have changed the outcome? We will never know for certain, but we do know this. His delay, driven by his fanatical faith in technology over strategy, gave the Red Army the one thing it needed most: time. Time to prepare, time to build the trap, and time to bleed the German Panzer Force white. The Battle of Kursk was more than just a failed offensive. It was the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht's offensive power was permanently broken. The strategic initiative was lost, and it would never be regained. From this moment on, the German army in the East would only know retreat. The long, bloody road back to Berlin had just begun. And as the Red Army began its unstoppable march west, what happens to an ideological war when the self-proclaimed master race is no longer the master? As the German army retreated across Ukraine and Belarus, they received a new order from Hitler: destroy everything, burn the villages, poison the wells, deport the people. If Germany couldn't have this land, no one would. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich in the East died at Kursk. The offensive power of the panzer divisions was spent. For the first time since 1939, the German war machine was not advancing, but rolling backwards. It was the beginning of a long 2-year retreat that would not stop until it reached the ruins of Berlin. From his concrete bunker in the Wolf's Lair, hundreds of miles from the front, Hitler watched his grand vision crumble. The maps on his table showed a tide of red arrows, Soviet armies, vast and confident, pushing relentlessly west. His response was not military pragmatism, not a tactical withdrawal to save his men. It was an outburst of pure ideological rage. He had promised the German people living space, Lebensraum. He had promised them a Garden of Eden, built on the ashes of the Slavic world. Now, that garden was being taken away. His solution was simple. If he couldn't have it, he would salt the earth. He would leave behind a desert. The orders that flowed from his headquarters were absolute. Directive Number 6, issued in September 1943, was chillingly clear. During the retreat, there was to be left behind not a single person, not one head of cattle, not a rail, not a house, not a mine that is not destroyed for years, not a well that is not poisoned. This was not a military strategy. It was a tantrum on a continental scale. On the ground, the retreat became an organized campaign of destruction. Special engineer battalions moved ahead of the retreating front lines. They blew up every bridge, every factory, every power station. They tore up thousands of miles of railway track using a giant hook called a Schienenwolf, a rail wolf, to render them useless. This was meant to cripple the Soviet advance, to slow their logistics to a crawl. But the destruction went far beyond military targets. The army, which once marched in as conquerors, now became arsonists. In villages across Ukraine and Belarus, soldiers went from house to house with flamethrowers and gasoline. They burned the wooden homes and the grain harvests in the fields. What they couldn't burn, they contaminated, dumping corpses into wells to poison the water supply. This was the final horrifying fulfillment of the Vernichtungskrieg, the war of annihilation. The SS and the regular army now worked in perfect, grim harmony. As the Wehrmacht prepared to pull back, SS units would sweep through an area, rounding up the entire civilian population. Anyone fit to work was force-marched west, a human tide of misery destined for slave labor camps in Germany. The old, the sick, and the children were often simply shot. They were deemed useless eaters, a burden on the retreating forces. A few German commanders were horrified. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, a brilliant strategist, saw this for what it was: military insanity. He argued that the wanton destruction was pointless. It wasted precious time and fuel that could be used to pull his troops back to a defensible line. More importantly, it erased any possibility of winning over any part of the local population. But his protests were whispers against a hurricane of fanaticism. Hitler's will was law. The army obeyed. This policy of total destruction, however, had an effect Hitler never intended. It didn't break the spirit of the Red Army. It forged it into a weapon of vengeance. Imagine a Soviet soldier fighting his way back to his home village after 2 years of brutal warfare. He arrives not to a joyful reunion, but to a smoking ruin. He finds the charred remains of his house. The well where he drank as a boy is filled with filth. His family is gone, either marched west as slaves or lying in a shallow grave at the edge of the forest. What does that soldier feel? Not fear, not despair. He feels a cold, burning hatred. The scorched earth policy became the Red Army's most effective recruiting tool. Every burned village, every murdered civilian was a personal call to arms. The war was no longer about communism versus fascism. It was about retribution. The slogan, "Death to the German occupiers," was no longer just propaganda. It was a sacred vow. For the German soldier, the Lanzer, carrying out these orders, a terrible realization began to dawn. He was no longer just a soldier, but a criminal. He knew what he had done. He had burned the homes and seen the deportations. He could guess what the advancing Soviets would do if they caught him. Surrender was no longer an option. There would be no mercy. He was now fighting not for victory or for the Führer, but for his own life, caught in a spiral of violence that could only end in death. The war he was ordered to create had consumed him. Was this a calculated military policy designed to slow a powerful enemy? Or was it the final, spiteful act of a failed conqueror, lashing out at the world that had rejected his monstrous vision? The answer is both. It was the logical endpoint of an ideology that saw people as obstacles and land as property to be exploited or destroyed. While the Eastern Front burned, a different fire was being kindled back in Germany. In the halls of the High Command, in secret meetings of disillusioned officers, a consensus was forming. The war was lost. The Führer was leading Germany into an abyss. The endless retreat, the scorched earth, the looming Soviet revenge, it all pointed to one man. They realized Hitler's orders to fight to the last man were not a strategy, but a national suicide pact. A small, brave group decided they would not sign it. They concluded there was only one way to save their country. They had to kill Adolf Hitler.